Hello, welcome back to
Uh,
the At Base Talk Show. I'm Jonathan Rodrigues. I'm going to be a host today, and I'm also the coordinator at the Institute of Organizational Dynamics, which is, of course, producing these At Base Talk Show series. The Institute of Organizational Dynamics, of course, is a membership think tank of the ECM group. And we got a fantastic lineup today, of course, to discuss a very, very important topic that's been on our mind for quite some time now, but we had to postpone this episode. Finally, it's happening. I'm really happy about it. I'm going to start off by saying a big hello to Perry Timms, who's the founder and chief energy officer at the People and Transformational HR Limited. So, hi, Perry. Thank you so much once again for joining us today.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
We also have Laura May, who's joining us from Brussels. She's a senior consultant at Prospect Institute, a mediator, mediation fangirl, as she likes calling herself, of course. And once again, thank you so much for joining us, Laura.
I'm happy to be back.
Thank you. And finally, of course, a very, very important person, of course, with us today is Anup Ravi, who's joining us once again from the UK. Anup is a mediation and resolution consultant with the ECM group. He's traveled quite a lot across the world, and I'm sure he's going to bring in all his experiences today where he talks about the effect of climate change and how it's impacting workplace cultures. Anup, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thank you for this opportunity. I'm really, really honored to be here and share the screen with you guys. Thanks.
Awesome. So the PACE talk show is, of course, hosted by the Institute of Organizational Dynamics, and it's supposed to be basically, an unrehearsed, unscripted perspective on things that are really concerning workplace culture around us. And we're going to get to it straight away, I would say. I just want to get those initial insights from you. You all work on the ground. You all have been kind of, interacting with people, interacting with organizations, interacting with leaders in companies, in firms who are already seeing these changes take place. What do you think is the impact of climate change on workers' health? And that could be physiological health, physical health, and of course the mental well-being. Perry, if I can throw this across to you right in the start.
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting at the moment is we got so used to being still for a lot of the time during COVID, right? So remote working, hybrid working, and so on. Yet there were still large swathes of the population that couldn't do that and had to continue to work. Now, I think what's happened in a physiological health situation is a lot of us have got used to that inertia. And I read something only recently that sort of prior to us becoming more sort of agricultural and civilized in that respect, we would regularly do 17, 20,000 steps. And now it's pretty good if you get 4,000, 5,000 steps per day. So physically, I think we've got a challenge. How do we compensate for the fact that we don't have to move so much? There's definitely that angle. And then the other thing I think is about anxiety. I think there are a lot of people who are very anxious about climate change and feel very helpless about it. And that, I think, plays on a lot of people's minds. So I think both physiologically and mentally, I think those two things are at play.
Laura, from your experience, of course, you're doing a lot of work in this space as well. Anything that comes to your mind?
Yeah, sorry, I was going to jump in because Perry's comment about sort of lack of movement really made me start to reflect on what our future could look like. Because, of course, we are talking about different kinds of roles, right? Because some of us during COVID were able to work from home and were very stationary. I basically became a slug and I fully confess to that. Others, of course, still were going out to their normal place of work. And looking forward into sort of times of climate change, these different types of roles are going to be affected differently as well. It could be that some of us continue to remain more sedentary and stay at home, and we really need to start to figure out, like, how do we stay active and stay healthy and not all have heart attacks at age 35? That would be nice. And at the other end of things, you've got people going out in increasingly extreme conditions. And not to mention the other effects of, increased disease and morbidity associated with that as well. So there's really a lot to bite into there, I would say.
Can I just say thank you, Laura? I really resonated with you when you said, it's the pandemic, and when people are able to go out and do certain kinds of work out there. I had the opportunity to work with a railway company in England, And during the pandemic time, there were lots of people working from home, whilst a whole lot of guys had to go out and work on the railway tracks. And they felt like, why do we have to do this? We have to go through the whole thing by when others are sitting back and relaxing, and we could be sat there at home, and they end up having accidents. They are stretched out more than their capacity, and they're kind of filling in for other people's roles and stuff. So there is a potential physical threat, of they're being overworked, they're functioning on less sleep, they're traveling a lot, they're commuting a lot. And that kind of translated even more when the fires happened in London. There was like a lot of firefighters and people really putting extra hours. And that's kind of causing a bit of a conflict within the workplace teams, where some people are feeling like we are pulling all the weight here, whereas you guys just sit at home and have it easy. And whereas people feeling like, we are being made to sit at home, this is not our choice. So that's creating a bit of dissonance and conflict within workplaces. So that's an interesting thing that I noticed in particularly that areas where people have to work outside, and not just working in front of a computer.
That is such a good point. Because I guess when we're talking about workplace culture, sort of the topic or sensible topic of this episode, right? We don't necessarily think about conflict management as part of that culture. But if we're seeing these divides, between different roles, so not even between organizations, but different people in the same organization, then really conflict management needs to be brought into workplace culture so that people are co-designing their jobs and able to express themselves and able to feel psychologically safe, which gets back to what Perry was saying about increased anxiety as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I'd like to hear from Perry. You mentioned about anxieties, and what sort of anxieties do show up in workplaces.
I think you're right. I think some of it is about privilege and about people who are perhaps even a little bit guilt-ridden about that privilege. Because I know I've done some work in local government where social workers were still out helping protect children, and their support teams were working from home, and they felt really guilty that they didn't feel like they were able to support them enough psychologically and in a trauma situation, because they had to do stuff over two-dimensional calls and not cool down conversations and so on. So I don't think it is just the resentment of those people out there. A lot of people choose to work in an outdoor environment because they really want to work in an outdoor environment, right? And it's other people sometimes who support them who feel inadequate in how they provide support. So that's some of the anxiety stuff that I've seen. And to your point about conflict, I think there's something really important about how we can demonstrate and give people the opportunity to appreciate what it's like working in different environments. So I know one print company, it's only a print company, right? It's not like life-saving stuff, who help people experience the production side, the driving side, the sales side, because they just needed to know what the whole value chain looked like so they could support people better. And I think there's more of that needed. It's not learning tourism, it's immersive realization and experience.
Yeah, it's since the pandemic, it's been a really, I feel like the COVID experience has been a wake-up call. It's like a preliminary kind of a trial run for something bigger coming, because the way things are changing, to hear temperatures going high every year, like, the highest in 50 years, highest in 60 years, to hear it in very hospitable regions of the world like Europe and UK. To me personally, in my eyes, are like, that's a very hospitable region compared to the sub-Saharan Africa or the Horn of Africa at the moment, like where we can experts expect a famine to be declared in Somalia, like possibly next month. But then those sort of things somehow still feels like it's so far away from us where we are sat in England. Right.
Yeah.
And it's not happening in our doorstep. It's not happening in our yard. So it feels like very distant. But then it's actually not very distant. It's forcing people to migrate. I mean, a very brash dive into history. Perry, you already mentioned in your introduction speech, where human beings have always migrated, and in back to like prehistoric times, where like nomadic population, it was
Yeah.
the wealth was cattle, and at the advent of agriculture, land became capital, and people stopped moving so much. But then it wasn't like nomadic people stopped existing and then agricultural people started existing. It was both were coexisting at some point. But when these migrations were happening, there were heavy conflicts. But in future travel fast into current days time, those migrations still do happen, but those conflicts are happening in workplaces. We have to build frameworks for these integration to happen in a much better way, and we have got better at it. But then there's still a lot of long way to go as well. It's not bloodshed anymore, but it's showing up in the form of anxiety. It's showing up in the form of mental aggressions, microaggressions within workplaces, and certain behaviors are accepted, and cultural differences come into workplaces, and it's becoming more and more of a challenge.
I want to
I
come in
really
here.
do.
I want to just catch on what this whole theme of privilege. I think that's because I was speaking to a friend of mine who works in house with a big company, and he was sharing a story with me about a colleague who actually is from the countryside. I myself live in the countryside, and I've been working remotely. But and then because he lives really in a very rural area, and he during this monsoon. That village got flooded. He had to bring in a lot of his family into the city, and this is a top tier city in India. And they had to all move into his one BHK right now, once a small apartment out here. And first of all, he was doing a bit of hybrid working, a bit of remote working, but he had that space, he had that freedom to come back home after a really tiring day of work, and he could just relax, he could have that downtime of his. But now suddenly he has to share that little space with six other people in a small little room. And of course, with the more people in a home, the more the stress. I think we all can agree on that. We have to look at different dynamics. So, and he says, he was sharing with my friend that he comes to work much more stressed right now. He comes to work a bit with his mood levels, compared to what they were before, have completely changed. And I mean, this looks like this looks like a story that's almost fitting into what this entire idea of saying that climate change might be indirectly changing our workplace cultures. And he has gotten a bit more moody now. He has gotten a bit more, I would say, edgy with his colleagues, and he gets more annoyed, and that's kind of reflecting very, very openly on his colleagues. I'm just wondering whether it's also a time to talk more about empathy. And Anup, you speaking about this, the workplace culture is changing, and I'm just trying to also bring together the theme of, do we have to start looking at empathy much more stronger in workplace culture, and how do we actually start putting this into practice? Because as a colleague of someone like this who's struggling, I would never know that unless he shared it with me, and I might be sharing that office with 99 other people. Laura, any initial thoughts on what I just said? Have you come across something like this in your experience as well?
Yeah, I mean, the experience that your colleague, well, you've described for your colleague, no, I don't think has happened to anyone that I know personally. Luckily, I mean, certainly though, we could see similar situations with people who were suddenly working at home and they had their small kids there, and I think that obviously that anxiety was brought to work, or sort of a series of emotions around anxiety. But I would say, with regard to empathy in the workplace, I think that, of course, we need to have this understanding of each other. And I mean, the research is consistent that good leaders are the ones who are emotionally intelligent and who are empathetic, and to help sort of create this workplace with the workers that is a supportive culture. What I would caution against is perhaps going that little bit too far, where people are almost required to perform their traumas. Because we need to always make sure people feel safe to express themselves, but are also safe to keep the things that they need to keep safe, like to themselves, right? So that is one caution I would add. But generally, I'm very pro empathy and oversharing.
I totally agree with what Laura just said. Right, we don't want in the effort to make people leaders feel more empathy for the co-workers, we shouldn't push it so far that they start performing it, like, giving it lip service, which is the so opposite that we want. Instead, focus on psychological safety to create a space. Leaders should strive to create a space where people feel comfortable to talk to anybody, and bring in their extra self into work, because that's what COVID, to me, in my eyes, is like, it's given a huge advantage for people in workplaces to be like, suddenly we've let, I mean, I don't know how many people are looking at this. I've got people looking into my house through this window, so it's I've brought that much more of myself into workspace now. So we need to create that extra bit where people can share what things are going through, in what they're going through. Like, suddenly a doorbell rings, or dogs barking, or a child is crying. It becomes more human. And I feel now that people are going back into work, they're forgetting, oh, right, forget all that. Now you're here, you have to be here. But let's take the goods along with us, carry on.
That's a really good point, because our lives were catapulted into what was not a real workplace, but a virtual workplace, right, in those examples. And it isn't just those people who are doing work through screens, because I think those people who were still turning up and having to work suddenly were able to talk more about isolation, safety, and so on, right? And what was going on in their houses and their children, and illnesses, and so on and so forth. So it brought a level of intimacy, I suppose, that I think has become a good thing, but shouldn't be either overplayed or just completely brushed away. Because I think we've now gotten used to bringing that into work. Now, I can remember somebody once saying, "This bring your whole self to work still." I don't want that, because there's some people there, I'd rather them just perform to a job role. And I thought, well, that's a bit wicked, because I think there's something now about how we find, and the Edelman Trust Barometer every year for the last few years has pointed to this. The workplace is considered to be a place of sanctuary compared to the rest of the chaotic world, like politics and institutions and so on, right? So I think there's something about that we should build on and utilize. We heard about rises of domestic violence during COVID because people were so compressed within their own environment. Now, if you've got a workplace sanctuary you can go to get some help and sort that out, that's a good thing. So I think there's an almost social duty in work that I think we should exercise in the right way. And psychological safety is a great place to start, because people need to know it's comfortable to express, that it won't be stigmatized, they will be able to get some help. So I think, as well as workplace mediation and conflict resolution, I think we're going to start seeing almost like counseling services and support services in the workplace for problems that affect people outside of work, but they cannot draw a line and pull the shutter down when they're in work. And they need their colleagues to understand that. So I think a more empathetic workplace is absolutely a lovely thing we should continue to strive for.
Yeah. And sorry, Laura, go ahead.
Sorry, thank you. I just wanted to sort of just jump in, though, really quickly on something that Perry said. And that was sort of this idea of like, oh, well, I don't want to be intimate in this way with these particular colleagues, right, because I don't like them. And I think that another thing, I feel like I'm the real downer today, but another thing I think we need to caution against is like sort of toxic positivity, or not maintaining personal boundaries, or not supporting people's personal boundaries in the workplace. Because at the end of the day, we don't all have to actually be best friends.
No.
And that's fine. No. But part of psychological safety for me is not just sort of, supporting staff and listening empathetically and having these, pro-mediation conflict resolution mechanisms, but it's also about recognizing that people can have their boundaries and supporting and maintaining those where they want to.
Yeah, absolutely. It's ultimately like, respecting people's spaces, right? And just saying like, this is your space, this is my space, let's cha-cha. That's what we're going for. And, to add to what Perry was saying about people working behind screens and stuff, it's working from home in compressed spaces with other people living and stuff. But then if you look at all those people who are single, who are living by their own themselves, and them being like, locked in one place, that can be extremely isolating. For us, like, we have like a 3-year-old daughter, and for her, the reality is like, mom and dad work from home. They're always there. And life is brilliant for us. But the colleagues that we have who are living by themselves are like, oh, come on, guys, we need to get back to work, get back into the office. We can't do this. You can feel that anxiety, and that's the impact that we could have, like, with climate changes coming through, and with this hybrid working being forced upon, some people feel like it's forced upon. It can have that, anxiety kicking in, why do other people get that kind of treatment? Just because you're married and have children, you get these sort of benefits and stuff. It's something to be watchful for.
But if I could actually speak to my experience for a moment, though, because I mean, you've just described me during COVID, right? I was living in a very, very tiny studio. I was obviously working online. I was single by myself. I had no housemates. I wasn't seeing anyone. I didn't see anyone I knew for 9 months, right? But my reaction wasn't, I want to get back to work and see people, because I quite like working by myself. But it was, what I need to be able to do in future is to have healthy boundaries with work. And to set up a way of working, it's 4 days a week for me at the moment now, where I can actually have that additional time to spend on social connections and spend on sort of care work and meaningful work to me. And so it's not all about, let's rush back to the office, that's the only place we can be safe. It's about supporting people in different ways of working and having that more sort of, I suppose you could say, transformative cultural approach, right?
Absolutely.
I love that. I think you've hit on something really important, which is we've overly romanticized the workplace as the only social hub in our life. It doesn't have to be. The Gallup survey that says, have you got a best friend at work, I find absolutely annoying as hell. It's like, you don't have to have a best friend at work. But if you've got people who've got your back, that's great. But Laura's point's brilliant. So we're a 4-day working week organisation too. So we can, if we choose to, ally to a local community, which may be something to do with the environment, the local infrastructure and pocket parks or whatever it might be. I think that's what we need to see people do more of, connect with their community about things that are happening in the environment that they can exercise in their time and create their social circle. Absolutely should do that.
I want to kind of shift focus to. Sorry, guys. I want to shift focus to the examples, or maybe the positive examples of organizations already putting things in place. I mean, what comes to mind very practically, and for all of us who follow football, I think we already see this. They did it during the COVID period, but they're now understanding this is not just COVID because of the the temperature levels rising everywhere. You cannot be playing 45 minutes of a half and with an intense football. And so I see a lot of organizations already having this drinks break coming through. So they're already being empathetic to what's happening, and they're realizing that this is not just, of course, COVID opened our minds to that this was important, but they are not putting this into practice. I was reading a meme which is actually very sad, and where the meme goes, I wish I could just call in sick so that I can just sit down and just relax and stare at my garden. And so it's a meme where someone's pretending to call in sick when they're not sick, but all that person wants to do is just sit outside and look into the garden. And I'm wondering why, and I'm sure there are a lot of people who struggle with that. I'm sure there are a lot of people who will tune into this someday and say, wow, I'm actually in that kind of a position. And why does someone have to do something like that? And it's probably because the organizations that they work with are not very welcoming to you coming up and saying, hey, today just isn't a good day. I'm not just in a bad mood. I'm well, but I just want a break, right? I don't feel like working today. And of course, you have your leave and you have your holidays and vacations, but it's just one of those days where you just have to get through that. And of course, I'm just wondering if y'all have met people who are already starting to empathize with the situation of climate change and already starting to put measures in place to understand what to make people feel more comfortable at work.
In my experience, yes. I mean, you've basically just described the grand Australian tradition of throwing a sickie, so taking a mental health day, which I think, while it's said jokingly, kind of gets to the core of the issue that mental health is health, and sometimes you really need to take time out and go stare at the garden, and that's totally fine. But I think you're also speaking to this wider point of perhaps we need to, when we're looking to the future, it's not just about with reference to the past. How do we change things in the past? How do we actually adapt our way of working so we can stay as close as possible to what we know? It's about actually envisaging the future that we want and building towards that. And that should be our reference point. And so it is about this empathy. It is about these things that we're talking about and psychological safety and workplace boundaries and recognizing that people have meaningful experiences outside of the workplace. It's not a sort of dichotomy between, oh, well, here's where work happens, here is just where I sleep and whatever. It's like, well, no, this is where the meaningful parts of my life take place, as well as maybe at work. But also, work doesn't always have meaning for everyone, and that's okay.
Yeah. It's I feel like this is where leaders or the senior leadership team come into play, and they play a real vital role. I was talking to a very close friend of mine who was a CFO of an aviation business, and he just got asked to become the CFO of the big business group. And I was asking him, like, how much do you guys have, like, talk about environmental impacts that the businesses are having? And he said, yeah, it's definitely a thing that we, senior leadership team, we definitely talk about. And I said, how much airtime do you give that average in percentage? And he said, 10%. And I was like, I felt good, but on reflection, I was like, 10% is very little. I feel like that should be a lot more. And, and, and he was saying it's actually very, very difficult to even if the CEO is fully bought in, who is driving, like, say, right, he said, let's find out what impacts, environmental impacts our business is having, the work that we're doing today. Next month they meet up because of other pressures, other deadlines and stuff. We had to deliver this. Can we do this? But can we look at this next month? Can we look at this next month? Can we look at this next month? It happened for 6 months' time. It always takes the back burner, and the CEO is feeling the pressure at some point, and it's like, we can't be doing lip service to this. We have to know this next month for sure. Otherwise, we're going to face some serious consequences. Then they get some findings on the table. But it's, even in spite of, like, people saying, like, right, this is who we are, lots of greenwashing happens, but
Yeah.
it takes, it's a new muscle that we need to exercise in our businesses, and the only place that can start off with is with the head. And the top senior leaders should say, like, right, this is a new exercise that we need to fit into our regime and routine. Let's exercise that muscle, because that's going to pay dividends later on.
I heard a great story recently of a growing enterprise in children's bikes, and they were very aware of their scope 1, 2, 3 footprint, and they were, from a leader position, very keen to reduce the impact on the environment. Of course, being steel, most of that was shipped in from China, so there's obviously a footprint on that. So they already went from air freight to shipping because it was better. However, the leader was so enabling of the teams. She said, like, teams, what can we do to continue to reduce carbon footprint? So what happened was they just checked how many spokes you needed on a wheel, and they found we don't need as many. So they cut out some spokes and a few other things, right? And they calculated that, and it had a huge impact on carbon footprint. And nobody wanted a bonus for that. Nobody said, I need some extra money for that because I've saved you some money. Everybody just did it out of almost like a climate duty. And that was a lovely story, because that said to me, people's motivation wasn't to earn more or just save money. It was to do the right thing by the environment. So I think there are examples where you're right. When a leader sets a challenge like that, it's not, I don't have the answers, but I'm not going to sit back and stop you from creating them. I think there's something really powerful in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for sharing that
Good
story.
It's good to know you're not the odd one out when you're trying to make a difference, because earlier you probably had to face a little bit of mocking, a little bit of that side glance to say, this guy is odd. Why is he so concerned about the environment? Or look at those eco-friendly plates and forks that he brings to the office. And now it's and you always had that someone laughing at you or someone smiling at you weirdly and saying, okay, he's the odd one out or she's the odd one out. I think now it's got to a place where if someone's not doing that, then you are the odd one out, because you're not being mindful, you're not being considerate about what's happening around you. I just want to, we touched on upon this very, I would say, we just glanced through it actually earlier on, where we talked about the fact that with climate change, of course, comes immigration acceleration, and we see that happening. We see a lot of cultures moving from a place where they have been for years and centuries, and moving into another region, and this, of course, leads to workplaces becoming more diverse, of course, and have to adapt to this cultural changes. I'm wondering very quickly, throw this out to all of you. Have you experienced this? Do you see leaders now becoming more aware? Of course, the EDI thing is on everyone's mind right now. You've got to make your workspaces equal, diverse, and of course inclusive. But it's more than just those concepts, because now you're starting to realize that earlier you probably had a workforce that everyone knew everyone's cultures very openly, because you all came from the same place. And now it's, of course, a whole different level. You're having somebody in the office who's probably not from the same culture. I'll give you my example, right? I'm moving into TCM now. I've lived my life in Goa in India for the last 30 years now, over 30 years. And I'm moving into London, and where I'm going to be with my colleagues who have been born and brought up in London. They understand the weather, they understand the eating habits, they understand the greetings, and how to deal with things that are sensitive and not sensitive. And they have been so open to me with feedback. And I'm wondering, why is it so important also for leaders today to make sure that that is on top of the agenda? Because the workforces are going to get diverse in every coming year. Any closing thoughts on that?
Can I go first on this one?
Yes, Perry.
I think we have to look at some birth trends, right? There are parts of the world with very, very low birth rates and a very aging population who will struggle to function as a country unless there is active immigration and integration of different cultures. That's almost like an economic fact we have to face quite soon. You look at Germany, you look at Japan, you look at all sorts of countries. They absolutely have to have immigration in order to compensate for population decline, right? So there's that. What worries me, though, is the political shift. We're seeing more right-wing anti-immigration things. Sweden, Italy, Hungary, it's happening. So business, again, has to take the lead here, because the politics will probably not sort it out from a policy directive and a societal directive. So I think businesses have a strong part to play for societal good, as well as addressing things like economic prosperity and employment conditions. That's my view on it.
Anup, did you want to go?
Yeah, you go first, Laura.
All right. I mean, I was just going to say that I'm not sure I've worked anywhere that was monocultural. It's not a normal experience in Australia, I think, at least once I sort of left my home state very, very early on. I mean, workplaces are always multicultural. You've always got different cultures and sort of different ways of incorporating that. And especially if you consider the role of the Aboriginal Australians, there's increasing education around how to be culturally sensitive there in the workplace. So yeah, this sort of monocultural experience you're describing is not one that I've really had. So we can touch base. And as far as what Perry said about sort of the conflict, so I did my PhD in international relations, and this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. And I'm going to plug the podcast I do, actually, which is Conflict Tipping, and it's about social conflict such as these and what we can do about it.
Nice.
That's brilliant, Laura. I totally am with you when you say, like, I've never worked with a monoculture, in a space. Same here. I've always had like people from different countries and working in the same high tense environment, emergency situations and stuff. But I noticed that there's a commonality there, which is high income countries or high income cities, for that matter, that's a very common thing. It's people feel very much at home. Of course, like, we've grown up with like people of different colors and cultures, different fashion, different hairdo and food, everything. But coming from India, and I'm sure Jonathan will agree with me, the diversity, though it is very diverse within India, but we don't see people from other countries working in the workspaces in India. There are lots of, I can think of a lot of other countries like that, even within Europe, in Portugal, in Romania, in the likes of Lithuania. You don't really see much of diversity in those countries, in those spaces. But monoculture is quite common in those spaces. When those people migrate to these higher income countries, they experience, a complete, it's a new environment. It's like, I don't know how to grapple with this. People have a certain way of communicating in English. In India, the way we communicate, or like in Romania, people write emails very formally, and that can be considered as rude here. Like I've experienced working in different environments where one culture it's a compliment, the same thing in another culture is an insult. Can you imagine like fireworks there? It's those things are something that HR workspaces and leaders should be really pushing that extra much more, and say, like, just because we are used to this kind of picture of people from different color, we are used to that, but the person coming in is quite new to the system, and that's a different perspective that leaders should dawn on and be mindful of, and try to propel that in workplaces even more.
We might have a new capability, which is cultural sensitivity. Then that might be something we look to leverage more, understand more, teach more, and so on. Because I think most people don't like to be culturally rude, but they just don't know.
Yeah.
So there's a real learning point. Yeah, nice. I like
Absolutely.
that.
If I could actually close with a story which relates to what Anup just said, I once had this very strange experience. As an Australian, I was living in Antwerp. I was asked to write a Christmas card from an elderly Indian man to a Russian stakeholder. So that was quite the experience. And I did it and they were very happy. So I think it comes back to maybe some cultural sensitivity.
Google Translate, increased functionality there.
Yeah, I personally wish if organizations can go even beyond just EDI to even beyond inclusivity. It's easy to make you feel like, I'm including them, but do they feel like they belong to that space?
Push them
to belonging is what I would get organizations to strive for, and inclusivity can be a thing that comes along in that journey, but belonging should be the end goal.
That's a good way to finish. It's all about belonging.
Yeah.
Well, Perry, Anup, Laura, thank you so much once again for joining us. This was an important topic. 40 minutes are not enough to talk about it for sure. We hope to have more episodes just talking about climate change and its impact on workplace culture. Those of you who are joining us for the first time, you have not checked out the other episodes on the talk show. They're all on our YouTube channel. Go out there and check them out. We've got some fantastic conversations. I hope to have the three of you on some other episodes in the future. But thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Great to work with you. Yeah.
Thanks.